presentation, we encourage you to also please use the Q&A feature within Conferences.io to ask your questions. You'll be able to see the questions that other people are asking, and you can use those little arrows to vote up the questions that you want answered. And then we're going to be doing a couple polls throughout the presentation as well. So those will appear on your devices once those are ready. So just quick intros. I'm John Pytel. I'm the CEO of Conferences.io. I'm sure most of you already know and familiar with Evan, but I'll kick it to Evan for a quick hello.
Yeah, hello everyone. Thanks for joining. Really excited to show you the latest and greatest with our integration. And for those of you who I haven't had the pleasure of speaking with before, I am the co-founder and the CEO of Prolaera. And yeah, really glad you could all make it.
Awesome. All right, so quick agenda here. We're gonna start out with just a real brief kind of history background on Conferences.io. I know many of you are already familiar with the tool, but for those of you who aren't, we're just gonna kind of bring you up to speed real quick on what we do and how we got here. Then we're gonna dive right into the attendance tracking functionality. We're gonna kind of break it down by different formats, group live or in person, group internet-based, virtual, and then of course hybrid. We're going to go into an actual live demo of the integration that Evan will lead. We'll kind of do a screen share and actually show you, live data in the platform. And then we're going to end with a Q&A session. So again, please use the Q&A feature within Conferences.io to submit your questions throughout, and we'll make sure to get to those at the end. So we're going to start off actually just with a quick 2 polls, just to kind of get you guys acclimated with the system, but information is also useful. So first one, we just kind of want to know, who's here, which of these different types of organizations best describes your company or your organization. So go ahead and launch that now. That should appear on your device. Okay. It's like primarily firms. Low member base made a late run there. Okay, awesome. Kind of the breakdown that I was expecting, but that's useful. So we're gonna do one more quick poll. This is a big one, right? This is kind of the $1 million question right now. Looking ahead to 2022 and beyond, which of these formats are you kind of expecting your organization to offer for CPE? Are you thinking you're gonna go back in some part to fully, in person or group live? I'm sure there's to some degree going to stay entirely virtual. Are you thinking about going hybrid, or maybe it's just still too early to tell? So we'll launch this poll. See what you guys have to say here. Hybrid off to a quick lead. Okay, wow. Group live coming back. Interesting. Okay. All right. Perfect. Okay, so at least half of you, or about half of you, are expecting to be going hybrid. Cool to see group live still being expected to come back though too. So, we got some late answers. Okay, now more than half of you expecting to go hybrid. Perfect. All right, so just a real brief kind of history of Conferences.io for anyone that's not familiar. So Conferences.io started out as just an engagement platform for live events, from conferences to trainings to panel discussions. Naturally, we just sort of got a lot of adoption in continuing education type settings, because it's a great tool for learning, right? Keeping the participants active and engaged. Within that, we of course started getting some traction within the accounting space, firms, associations. We started learning about NASBA and the different NASBA requirements. At the time, we were able to help with some of them, such as that element of engagement and the Q&A and the evaluations. But along the way, we kept hearing over and over this pain point around tracking attendance, right? Our customers kept telling us, hey, we already use Conferences.io for all of our CPE just for engagement and learning purposes. Is there any way that we could also use it to solve this, get away from sign-in sheets or things like that? So in 2018, we really dove in to get a really deep understanding of everything attendance tracking. And we ended up launching this full kind of attendance tracking functionality on top of the product. And it was a total home run. This is from one of our customers showing what we call our kiosk mode, where it's basically a digital replacement of a sign-in sheet. right? This is a quote, we had to keep it anonymous, but from one of the big firms talking about how many hours they were able to save tracking attendance at their big conferences, and not to mention the dollars they were able to save compared to badge scanners. We built out integrations with LMSs such as Prolaera, but we also even added the ability to generate and send certificates right from Conferences.io, where not every organization uses an LMS, or even those that do, sometimes their external facing events don't go back to the LMS, or there are at times needs for certificates as well. This is a case study with one of our customers, the Virginia Society of CPAs, who does a ton of CPE. And prior to implementing Conferences.io, they were spending 320 hours a year just dealing with attendance. After implementing Conferences.io, that dropped down to only 55 hours a year. So we were able to reduce the amount of time that they have to spend dealing with CPE attendance by 80%, which is pretty significant. So by the end of 2019, things were rolling. We were adding more and more in the accounting space. We're doing over 10,000 CPE events a year. And then all of a sudden COVID hit, and live events became extinct, and for the most part really have, until recently. So this made us realize that we needed to change, kind of reset our strategy and vision for things. And we realized that we're not going to stay 100% virtual forever, like the world we've been living in, but virtual is here to stay, right? Like things aren't just going back to the way that they were. And we realized that we needed to kind of adapt around that. So this is still all playing out, right? And like I said, it's kind of the million-dollar question. It'll probably vary based on organization too, but the future of your CPE programs is going to be some combination of these formats, right? And there are other outside factors, like all of the changes that are happening just to the workforce, right? And this huge surge of now, the remote and kind of hybrid workforce that are impacting how you can and need and will offer your CPE programs. There's a lot to think about here, right? There's, of course, the idea of getting back totally in person. There's, of course, going to remain a lot of fully virtual, ton of interest in talk about going hybrid. For many organizations, particularly like firms, you may be looking at this kind of multi-office or satellite office setup where you've got groups of people joining virtually, but they're watching it together, right? Versus all individually, from their own computers. Maybe you're having to think about or plan around a combination of all of these. You're going to have the training happening in person, but then there's going to be groups of people watching virtually together in other offices. But then you also need to open it up to individuals to join virtually. If your organization offers conferences, which are kind of their own animals, conferences in general, just there's a lot of logistics that go into those. But if you offer conferences, you got to think about the same things too, right? There's a lot of demand to get back in person for conferences, but virtual is not going anywhere. You've got to keep that in mind, particularly if you're thinking about going hybrid, right? So there's all these different scenarios to think about. And on top of that, the compliance standards differ, right? The requirements when it's in person are different than when it's fully virtual, and then hybrid's kind of a combo of those. The instructional design differs. The standard kind of 60-minute session at a conference or a 1-hour webinar, it's very one-to-many kind of lecture format, whereas the trainings and seminars are really anti-lecture, right? It's very two-way interactive and breaking out into groups, discussing and coming back together. The ability to participate differs depending on if they're in person, joining to virtually by themselves, joining virtually as a group. So everyone's kind of juggling all these different platforms and technologies. They've got one way they need to track attendance for group live, for the classroom style trainings. They've got a different way, maybe badge scanners or Conferences.io for their conferences. Maybe you use one webcast platform for your internal CPE trainings, but you need to use something different for things that are external. If you do conferences, maybe you need something more robust, like a full virtual conference platform. Then you've got to figure out how to get all that data back into the LMS and get the certificates issued and into the compliance. It's just kind of leaving everyone feeling a little bit overwhelmed, right? This slide usually resonates with everyone because that's kind of how everyone's feeling. There's just so many different variables and things to think through, and still so many unknowns. So, our new vision is just to calm that chaos, whatever the new normal ends up looking like for you or for your organization, and to just be that single attendance tracking and engagement solution for all of these group-based CPE events, meaning whether it's fully in person, fully virtual, or hybrid, whether it's that classroom style training or a big conference, whether they're internal, external attendees, right? Just that, that one platform that is going to kind of calm that chaos as far as the attendance tracking goes. So speaking of which, let's dive into the actual functionality that we're talking about here. We offer a few different ways that you can track attendance, and we're going to break this down first, just how it works for group live or in person. So the first kind of mode that we will show you, we call our kiosk mode. This is really designed for the kind of classroom style trainings, like a single, track event. It's not really designed for like a conference that has, concurrent track, but it's really designed just to be a digital replacement of a sign-in sheet, right? With the integration with Prolaera, you can actually preload the registered attendees onto the digital sign-in sheet so that when the attendees come in, they can quickly just find their name and check in, or you could have a staff person that checks everyone in. Some organizations do it one way, some do it the other. What pretty much all of our customers do when they're using kiosks is they kind of set the policy as everyone needs to check in. If you leave early, then you need to check out. If they happen to come back, that's fine. They can check out, check back in. But then rather than making everyone like line back up at the end and check out one by one, what they do is they just utilize our bulk checkout functionality, where it slaps the timestamp of whatever time the session ended. So you have the complete data record, time in, time out, how long they were there for, but just makes this process a little more seamless to where anyone that left early checks out, they're not going to get full credit, but everyone else, they were there the whole time. The second mode that we offer, we call our self check-in mode. So this one works really for any event format, from a small training to a huge conference. The attendees use their own device or browser to access Conferences.io. This is the mode that you guys are using today. And the attendees check in and check out in real time. So basically, the way that it works is they access Conferences.io and check in. Then they're taken to the session page where they would participate in Q&A or polling or any of that interactive functionality. And then they check out at the end. I also just want to quickly mention that again, for that kind of multi-office or like satellite office setup, this works really, really well. The kiosk and self check-in modes play well together. You could have the group that is in person use the kiosk, and the attendees that are joining together virtually use self check-in, or vice versa, or any combination of it just makes it really seamless for everyone. So the attendance reporting for Group Live is pretty simple. We capture the time in, time out, total duration. With Conferences.io, you can actually automatically adjust the credits based on whatever the requirements are. In this case, pretty simple. We say they had to be there for at least 50 minutes to receive full credit. So when that runs, it then would automatically adjust anyone who wasn't there long enough to receive credit down to 0 credit. Pretty simple for Group Live, but with that, I'm going to quickly kick it over to Evan just to talk a little bit about how the LMS integration for Group Live works.
Yeah, that's great. And John, there was one question about using bulk checkout for kiosk mode or not kiosk mode. Is, with my understanding, you can use the bulk checkout for any check-ins. Is that correct?
Yeah, you can do bulk checkout for either. Yeah, we could get deeper into that, but quick answer is yeah.
Great. Awesome. Yeah. And so on the Proalera side, talking about, okay, so what do we do with this information? How do we tie these two systems together? So in a Proalera event, when you have your Conferences.io integration set up, you can pick your session or sessions, we'll talk about that in just a moment, that you would like to link to a Proalera event. Once that event is completed and there are attendee check-in and check-out timestamps and the resulting durations, those will automatically pull into Proalera. And as John mentioned, if you use the built-in Conferences.io credit adjuster, you can now sync those adjusted credits in automatically into Proalera, and it will sync those credits directly in the Proalera Event Manager interface. So basically, you just sync, it will override all the credits that are in the Proalera event. You can click submit, and it'll generate your certificate, post the credits and everything, just like you would otherwise expect. And I'll show you that in more depth in the live demo. And we've kind of alluded to this a couple different times, but for scenarios where you have multiple sessions for one Proalera event, so this could be an all-day event, like the example shown here, where you have a morning session, maybe there's a lunch break, people check in and out again in the afternoon. You can add both of those unique Conferences.io sessions to one Proalera event. And again, you can still use the credit adjuster or the credit sync. It'll pull in the attendee durations for each of the individual sessions that people are checking in and out of. So again, it's effectively the exact same process. You're just doing that credit adjustment in Conferences.io for those two sessions, and then syncing those credits into Proalera. And again, I'll show you a live example of this a little bit later.
Awesome.
Cool.
All right. So moving right along into group internet-based formats or virtual. So I actually do want to do another poll real quick here and just kind of understand which virtual or webcast platforms are you guys using for your CPE? So I'll go ahead and launch that. All right, kind of as expected. Okay, so the big ones for the most part. Okay, others making a little run there. Okay, so yeah, the big four: Zoom, Teams, WebEx, and GoToWebinar, meeting, training. So we know that directly integrating into these virtual platforms is ideal, and we do our best to make that happen whenever we can. We have a full integration like that with already with Microsoft Teams, where we have the Microsoft Teams app, which allows the attendees to access Conferences.io right from within the Teams meeting platform. Basically, it just eliminates the need to use a separate device or a separate browser. Any day now, we should have the same thing launched with WebEx. We're basically at the final stage. It's already built out. It's just waiting final approval from WebEx. So that should be coming any day now, where same concept, Conferences.io can be accessed right from within the WebEx platform, so that it just sits right beside the video or the screen share. Zoom was actually the first one to announce this apps type program, which now pretty much all, they're all kind of following suit. That it was supposed to be launched in January of this year. Then they pushed it to March, and they pushed it to May, and now there just has not been a new specific like ETA. So we've been saying that this is coming soon, for a while, but they're going to be over a year now past their initial timeline. So it should just be a matter of time. They launched their kind of beta program of it over the summer. We thought that the general availability of it would be coming shortly after that, but it just hasn't yet. So I'm not going to hold my breath. We don't have an exact ETA on this, but any day now they should open up the ability for us to build that integration as well, which we'll of course jump all over. That being said, we do have another option for the kind of one-to-many or like webinar style events where, and this works with Zoom webinars, you can actually put the virtual meeting into Conferences.io instead of vice versa. And that way you've got Conferences.io sitting right alongside the video or the screen share. And this is already launched and working, and it works with Zoom webinars, YouTube live events, and a couple of others. For those of you that do virtual conferences, Conferences.io can also be integrated into many of those platforms. Basically anything that allows for like an iframe, Conferences.io works really well with. These are some of the examples, but certainly not an exhaustive list. We do want to point out though that we also did make like the conscious decision that the second device experience, had to be part of our core strategy. We have to design around that second device experience working just as well as if it's integrated, because we realize that we're never going to be able to integrate with every platform that's out there. We also didn't want to become entirely reliant on those platforms, right? They make one change, they pull the plug on something, and now all of a sudden, everything that we built around is the rug gets pulled from under it. And at the end of the day, the second device route can work really well, right? It's no different than if they were there in person. We make it really easy with QR codes and things like that. And so that's what we kind of wanted to show here today, that it's not, we understand the benefits of when it is directly integrated. It can work really, really well through a separate device as well. So we're going to do one more poll here. And we want to know, so for the big difference for virtual CPE, right, of course, is that there's that additional requirement of the 3 participation checks per hour, right? They want to make sure that someone doesn't just join the virtual meeting and go and watch TV. So real quick, we just want to know, how's your organization currently doing these? Are you doing polls that are actually tied to the content? Are you doing just the, are you still here polls, code words, or something else? So I'll launch that real quick. Interesting. Other, decent amount of other, and it's growing. Interesting. I'd kind of be curious to know what that other option is, but for the most part, kind of what we typically expect, right? And polls are typically the most common solution there, because nearly every one of these virtual platforms offers some of these basic interactive features, usually at least some sort of kind of just multiple choice, type polling tool. And while those are convenient because they're just part of the platform, it's pretty clear that they're not doing a great job of actually keeping attendees engaged. Every study that comes out about virtual training, virtual events, the #1 challenge that gets reported back is keeping people engaged. And this one survey that we found said that 81% of virtual event hosts use polling to improve the interaction, but only 1% of them found that it was actually easier to keep people engaged when it's virtual. So with Conferences.io, you don't have to sacrifice the engagement for convenience, right? Conference.io offers a really robust polling functionality where you can go far outside the lines of just your basic multiple choice polls. Multiple choice are great, but we offer things like these open-ended questions that you can do in these word clouds or these Wordle displays, or we call these thought bubbles, where the attendees would be responding with slightly longer responses. We have things like brainstorm polls, and we're actually going to do one of these kind of at the end, but the attendees submit their ideas or their answers, and they can like or upvote each other's ideas. It gives the instructors, the presenters, far more flexibility in terms of the types of questions that they can ask, things that actually do keep people engaged, that aren't just limited to choosing from a preset list, which a ton of the purpose of engagement for learning and the types of questions that we want to ask that have an impact on learning can't really just be limited to, it only goes so far to choose from a list, right? So by giving the instructors and the presenters these additional capabilities and options, it really opens up that flexibility for them. We also offer things like pre-post comparisons, where you can see how answers or opinions change from the start to the end. In this case, we kind of used it for learning assessment, where we can see at the start, only 24% of people got it correct, but now at the end, 85% got it correct. We have things like demographic comparisons, where basically you kind of segment 2 different polls together. So we asked, what role are you? That's on the bottom there. And then what are your 3 biggest challenges? And we can now see how those challenges differ based on the type of role. And I'm actually going to show you, this is a live example from today. So earlier we asked, what type of organization are you? And then what CPE formats do you expect to offer? And you can see right here, live, during the actual instruction, the breakdown based on the type of organization. Outside of just the sort of limited functionality and engagement, we also identified a number of other just general pain points with using those built-in polls. The first of which is that they often, or they're all a little bit different, right? But pretty much across the board, you have to manually create these polls from scratch every single time. You also have to have someone manually launch these polls. So either you have to have a moderator sit in, just to launch the polls, or you've got to rely on the instructor to launch them, which often leads to forgetting to launch the polls. For sessions that are longer than an hour, it's not always easy to know like which polls belong to which hour, right? If everyone responds to every poll, then great. But let's say that someone responds to 4 out of 6 polls, right? It's a 2-hour session, they respond to 4 out of 6. Does that mean that they responded to 3 in the first hour, 1 in the second, 2 in the first, 2 in the second, 1 in the first, right? You don't know how to apply the credit accordingly without having to really dive into the reporting and everything, which can at times be a nightmare, right? These web platforms aren't producing reporting designed for CPE, so it can be a real nightmare to have to pull and compile all those reports together. And finally, there's just been this sort of necessity of juggling these different platforms due to the differences or limitations, where we've talked to a ton of firms that have been saying that they already use Teams for everything internally, but they use something else for their CPE because Teams doesn't have a polling feature. Their attendance reporting is a little sketchy. So there's just all this juggling going on in terms of having to use these different platforms just because of limitations. And so with Conferences.io, we can solve those pain points. With the polls, you can copy polls that were previously created. If there's courses that repeat over and over, you can copy the entire course, including all of the polls. You don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. The polls integrate directly into the presentation, just like you've seen here today. So it makes it really seamless for the instructor. They just move from slide to slide, just like normal. It automatically launches the poll. When they move on, it closes the poll. There's no forgetting, to launch them. We can tie the polls back to specific fields of study. So there's no dilemma about, well, which of the polls they respond to or not. And then, everything that we've done is just designed specifically for CPE. You can auto calculate and adjust that credit, directly integrates back to Proalera, or you can use our certificates if needed. We also, though, did build a new feature specifically for this participation check requirement, which is called code words. And the way that works is that you tell Conferences.io how many code words you need for that session. It automatically generates these 3-digit codes and a set of PowerPoint slides that the only manual part of this whole process is that these slides need to get inserted into the presentation. So you can literally drag and drop or copy and paste them in, but it's like the only manual step here. And then once the instructor gets to that code word slide, in the presentation, the attendees, and you can actually try this one out right now. If you click that little code words button on Conferences.io and pop in 335, it'll tell you if it was correct or not. But it's that simple, right? There's no forgetting to launch them. There's no having to manually create them over and over again. So, and it also reports back by field of study and all of that. So the idea behind developing the code words was we wanted to offer something that was as close as possible to like fully automated, right? And so, but with it, we did not want it to discourage the use of like content related polls, right? Because they're great for learning. But the idea was you can use code words just to make your life like as easy as possible on the compliance end, right? Make sure that you're satisfying the participation monitoring mechanism is as easily as possible. But if you still want to incorporate, or if the instructor still wants to incorporate some polls for learning purposes, they absolutely can. Like they play really well together. There's nothing that prevents that. But you can use the polls for their intended purpose, which is learning, without all that added pressure of, okay, we got to come up with enough poll questions. And what happens if we, don't get through them all and all of that, right? The code words makes your life easy in terms of compliance, but the polls can just be focused on their purpose, which is learning. So as far as the attendance reporting goes, for when it's virtual, you of course get the duration, but we also report back the code word completions or the poll completions. You can run that same credit adjustment based on how many polls they needed to respond to or how many code words they need to respond to. And that will automatically adjust the credits appropriately. In this case, we can see that Bob did all 4 of his auditing code words, but none of his tax. So it automatically adjusted him to 0 tax credit. We're also working on the ability to do partial credit adjustment. And so this will kind of play 2 roles. One, it will just allow you to do partial credit to where for longer multi-hour sessions, they didn't do all of the code words, but they did enough to get some credit. That'll be able to be automated. But what this will also do is actually allow you to even further automate the process where it can kind of be like the defaults. So in this case, this would be the default rule set if for any session that is for 4 credits, and you wouldn't even have to apply that rule over and over again. So with that, I'll kick it over to Evan again, quick, just to talk about some of the new enhancements to the integration for group internet-based.
Perfect. Yeah, and I will show a live demo of a few of these things here coming up shortly, including code words, how those can be used in conjunction with polls. So again, kind of building on the example we had earlier, similar idea. You can do check-ins and checkouts to get attended durations. You can also get attended durations from your actual webcast platform if that integration is supported as well. So those durations can come from both of those sources, but then the recommendation is to use Conferences.io as your attendance tracking option, because you can use polls if you prefer. Like John has shown throughout this presentation, you can also use code words, which the attendees essentially are able to self-validate, and you can particularly use those code words to get subject area specific credit adjustments. And again, I can show you some examples of that later on. But all of those participant details, whether it's one session or even multiple, will all be consolidated in the Proalera event with the sessions that you have selected for that. So it's very similar to Group Live, except you're getting extra data back. You're getting those polls and the code words, and then the extra features and how adjusting those credits work on the back end in Conferences.io. Perfect. Yeah, and then this is just an example of the data that we're pulling back from, again, 1 or more platforms. So if there is some attendance data from, say, Zoom, you can see that here. You can see the actual polling responses. Again, the kind of the code word totals are linked by field of study, so you can get those listed there as well. So you can see which specific code words were answered correctly for each specific session. And again, I'll show you a live example of that here shortly.
Cool. All right, so almost at the end here, but probably the hottest topic, which is hybrid. So I'm going to skip past this actually. I want to make sure that we have enough time for the live demo and to get into Q&A. So I'm going to skip past that poll, but hybrid event, meaning attendees in person and virtual simultaneously. It's a pretty hot topic right now. And while there's a ton of benefits and upside to doing it, there's also some challenges to pulling off successfully. With Conferences.io, we can help bridge that gap and allow everyone, regardless of how they're attending, to participate together, meaning that they can check in for attendance purposes the same way. They can participate in the same Q&A session, respond to the same polls. We've added a new feature to where you can mark the session on Conferences.io as hybrid for the delivery format. And for those hybrid sessions, when the attendees go to check in, it will automatically prompt them to indicate how they're attending. Is it in person or virtual? And that way, we also capture that on the back end. So when we're adjusting these credits, if someone didn't respond, if someone was there for the whole time, but they didn't respond to enough of the polls or the code words, that's okay if they're in person, right? At least based just on the kind of default NASBA standards. I know some organizations they just tell everyone that they need to do all of the polls or all the code words, regardless of how they attend. But just based on like the NASBA standards, the in-person people follow the in-person or the group live standards. Virtual people follow the group internet-based standards. So this new hybrid setting allows you to just further automate that step as well, where the in-person attendees would still have the ability to respond to the polls and everything, but they don't have to be reliant on them for credit. So one more time, we'll kick it over to Evan, just to talk quickly about the LMS integration for hybrid, and then we'll go into the live demo.
Perfect. So yeah, so a couple things. I've alluded to different bits and pieces of this so far, but again, for a particular session, you could have a Zoom meeting or a Zoom webinar or another integrated platform connected to the same Proalera event as a Conferences.io session. And it's able to pull in the relevant data for each of those attendees. So once you get to the step where you're doing your credit verification, basically you can set up the Proalera event so people register for the location that they expect to attend. That can include a webinar option. Obviously, if they're joining via Zoom, they can answer the polls using Conferences.io. And it's up to you then if you would like to also encourage the folks checking in and out in person to participate in either code words or the polls themselves. That can be nice for consistency. Again, it's kind of an elevated level of attendee verification for those who are live, which certainly doesn't hurt, but it kind of keeps a consistent experience for the entire audience. And so then once you get to the certificate issuance stage, any relevant data that gets pulled in. So if folks actually join the Zoom session, you'll see Zoom participation details in this example. And then you'll also see any other Conferences.io based engagement, whether that's check-in and check-out duration, code word responses, and or polls. And then again, regardless of whether or not you choose to have everybody do the polls or not, you can use the built-in Conferences.io attendance verification features to adjust those credits and then sync those into Proalera as well. So again, I'll show you some live examples of some of those different options too.
Yep. Or you could always just use the virtual attendees use Zoom, and you could do the polls through Zoom if you prefer, and keep it to just Conferences.io for the in-person attendees.
Yep.
In which case there wouldn't be polls or code words or anything. But I think that transitions nicely into the next point here, to where you could also use Conferences.io for both. Sorry, I was trying to cue that up for you, Evan. But just to kind of explain this one real quick. Yeah,
absolutely. So same idea, where I kind of alluded to, okay, great. If everything attendance related is just coming from Conferences.io, that's the only thing you really need to connect. Obviously, those who are attending remotely, you can include a webinar link. You can still connect that platform, but really you're getting all of your CPE related attendance data out of Conferences.io. So again, it's going to fetch polls from wherever those polls were run from. So if you use exclusively Zoom for the remote participants, it'll get the Zoom polls, for example. If you're using Conferences.io for those who are attending group live in person, and you just say, hey, just check in and check out, you get those durations. They're registered for a group live location. You'll get their attended durations there. And then for those attending remotely, you can say, please, participate in the polls. And so if there are polls or code words, those will flow into the folks who participated in those engagement mechanisms as well. So it'll just kind of pluck the data where it exists from the platforms that they actually came from, and then they all get brought into Proalera, where you can, again, use that credit adjuster to finalize the credit amounts. Awesome. Yeah. And so again, kind of across these different types, or a few kind of just common steps, you capture attendance however you need to, right? So if it's only group live, just have people check in and check out. You can use kiosk mode if you prefer. You can have folks self-check in and check out, bulk check out when the session is completed. If it is a virtual only, you can use one of the built-in, kind of connectors or add-ons for your platform with Conferences.io. You can have folks use that second device, as John mentioned earlier, to do the polls, other participation, and so on. And then for the hybrid sessions, again, you can decide to have everyone do polls and or code words, whether they're in person or not. You can have everyone check in and check out through Conferences.io. And then you can do a little bit of a combination where those who are attending live in person will use the check-in and check-out features of Conferences.io, but get polls from Zoom, for example. So basically, you just take your tools in your platforms, get the attendance data that you need for those particular participants. That data gets generated. In Conferences.io, you can run the credit adjuster for the relevant groups of users using Conferences.io. Then all that data then pulls into Proalera, where you can sync the adjusted credits and then can generate the certificates, issue the CPE for compliance reporting purposes. And again, I'll show you a couple examples here in just a moment.
Yeah, and just to kind of wrap that, so the title of this webinar was completely automate your attendance tracking process, right? And so I think thanks to the updates that Evan and his team have done here, you can really achieve that now. No matter if it's in person, live, virtual, you capture the attendance on Conferences.io, you can take advantage of our automated credit adjustments, and then you just sync it back to Prolaera. So like literally in those 3 steps, you can pretty much reconcile the attendance for whatever format you need to be prepared for. So with that, we'll jump into a quick live demo that Evan will lead us through here. Stop sharing so that you can take it over.
All right, can you see that okay?
Yep.
All right, perfect. So for kind of a live demo here, I have a couple sessions. So I have 2 examples. One is kind of a typical, hey, we have a 1 hour, maybe 2 hour training. We've got one Conferences.io session that we're using to do all of our attendance tracking. And then we have another one here that has 2 Conferences.io sessions and a Zoom option for folks to attend. So I'll go through a couple of details there. And then I have the Conferences.io sessions here where you can see the participation reporting for things like code words and or polls. We've already used the bulk credit adjustment option here, where, as mentioned, you can use polls, time spent, and or code word verifications there to validate the actual participation credit and determine how much credit folks should need. You can also make individual manual adjustments in the interface if you ever need or desire as well. And then I'll show you how those actually pull into Proalera, and we have a couple of different examples. So we'll start with this one where we have a Proalera event. It's connected to one Conferences.io session. If we go to the certificates page, it has been able to fetch the participant details from the Conferences.io session, and it will kind of populate that against the registrant list. So if folks are registered only or checked in only through, say, Conferences.io, for example, it'll automatically pull them into the Proalera report. So basically what you can see here, we have a whole bunch of folks, different levels of code words. But then the things that we can do here is we can do a sync, and anyone here who has kind of 0 participation will be able to check in and check out, or 0 participation in one of these linked sessions. So we can do a sync, and you'll notice it'll do checks as well for things like incompatible subject areas. So what that will do is basically provide a quick validation on a particular Conferences.io session. And if your credits that have been added here don't match a known subject area in Proalera, it will basically notify you of that. And so let's say taxes was misspelled and it was TAXSE or something to that effect. You'd be able to see that there. And kind of a similar idea here with a multi-session, it's able to pull in the combined adjusted credits across those 2 sessions concurrently. So it's basically able to load and sync all that data, compile it for you, and you can see all of those checked against that. John, is there a deadline for when the check-in or check-out process and the relevant code needs to be provided? I assume that's at the close of the session, something to that effect.
Yeah, so that kind of comes down to the organization's preference, or Susan, in this case, your preference or policy. You can, I would say that most of our customers just require that they're submitted before the session ends, right? But if you wanted to, you could give them 24 hours to submit them afterwards, for whatever reason. So I think most commonly it's just before the session, is over, but you could extend it if you want to. It just kind of comes down to your policy, or really like when, maybe it's impacted by what your kind of cadence is for reconciling things in Proalera and closing it out, right? So if that, if you do that right after the session or at the end of that day, then the deadline needs to be before then. So it's flexible, just kind of up to you.
Okay, great. Yeah, that seems to be kind of a recurring question here in the questions. And then kind of back to this example, this is kind of the interesting multi-session one where, as you can see, we have code words actually across multiple sessions. So you get copies of that reporting data back from Conferences.io here. So we can see specifically which sessions were responded to. So we can see in this example for the morning session, we had 12 code words for 4 credits of taxes. And then the afternoon session, which is a little more interesting, covered 2 credits of taxes and 2 credits of specialized knowledge. So for each attendee, you can easily reference this information. Again, you can sync in the credits automatically from Conferences.io. If there are polling responses, you can see polls, whether they are launched through Conferences.io or if these came from Zoom or another webinar platform. These will pull in as well, so you can see exactly which ones they responded to and or which ones they missed. So again, with the automatic credit adjuster, once you have your sessions, whether it's 1, 2, or 10, you'd go through for each session, run the credit adjustment, and then you can basically select your group and then sync those CNF credits here. And then those credits will post through automatically to each attendee in that session. So again, this is kind of a fun example where you get a mix of different data sources, you have multiple sessions. So this can work really well for, again, like an all-day training, or if you have a multi-day training and you're running a bunch of concurrent sessions, you can connect all of those to one Proalera event, and it will be able to aggregate all of these adjusted credit amounts across one or more Conferences.io session that you have set up. Cool. There's a question here about will the attendee reports auto update to the event materials? So that's a good question. It doesn't upload as an event material by default, but we do store all of this information in our database as well. So it'll live both in Conferences.io and the data that we sync, we actually store permanently with the event. So all the polling responses, the code words, the check-in and check-out times, durations, and so on will all be stored in Proalera automatically as well. Okay, I'm looking through a couple of these other questions here. John, this would be a good one for you. So, in this example, we're showing both polls and code words used concurrently. There might be some real world examples. I think most folks will likely pick between one or the other. From what you've seen from various organizations, how do they pick, and why do polls end up winning out over code words or vice versa?
Yeah, this is a good question. So the first thing I'll say is that our recommendation is always, if you're using code words, use code words or do as many code words as needed to satisfy the participation checks, right? So I mentioned earlier, you can absolutely do both code words and polls at the same time, but what we don't typically recommend, wouldn't be the end of the world, but we don't typically recommend, like, if you need to do 9 participation checks, do 9 code words, or if you're not using code words, do all 9 polls. Don't do 5 code words and 4 polls to combine to equal the 9, right? So that's the first thing I'd say. In terms of how do you choose, should we use polls or code words? A lot of it just comes down to the L&D team, their preferences, their resources, their existing process, right? The idea behind code words was, again, just to as close as possible, it's like automatic, automate the whole participation checks, right? Code words alone don't really have any benefit, though, in terms of like learning, right? It's not tied to the content at all. They're just, other than just you're making sure that people are paying attention. you don't get any of the benefits of like doing content related type polls. So if you're an organization that favors more of the learning side of things, and you don't mind, maybe it's already part of your process, or you don't mind maybe putting in a little extra work to get the polls set up and all of that, then you could absolutely use polls and not need code words. But if you're an organization on the other end of the spectrum, and it's just maybe you're not a believer in polling for learning, or you just number one priority is time savings and automation, code words works awesome for that. And the last thing I'll mention there is that one thing we have kind of discovered that it would be a limitation of code words is, like every L&D team is a little bit different, or for like associations or state societies that are bringing in like external presenters to where they don't have control over the final presentation. The instructors aren't submitting it ahead of time, which is common, right? But it's not always the case. If that's not the case, then the code words can be a challenge, because there is that one step of, these slides just need to get put into the presentation. But if that's already part of the process, the instructors submit their slides ahead of time, the L&D team can pop those code word slides in, boom, no problem. But if not, and it's, like I said, external presenters or whatever, you just don't require them to submit them in, then that's what, that could be one kind of limitation of using code words. But it just, again, it really comes down to kind of your preference. We wanted to provide, multiple different options. And you can also, use both, but just, use the code words for compliance, polls for learning. So there's different routes you can go there.
Awesome.
So we got 4 or so minutes left here, and maybe I'll just throw up the Q&A on screen real quick. We can, if anyone needs to jump, feel free, but we can go through as many of these questions as we can here. So just looking at some of these, so we already addressed that one. So someone asked, can you remind me, for a hybrid event, what's the correct certificate to be issued? So a couple things here. For the certificate purposes, if you're just able to submit one create one certificate for everyone, the NASBA standard, I know not everyone follows NASBA, but I'm just going to be going off of the NASBA standards here, is that you can display the delivery format of whatever the higher percentage of the attendees were. So if you had 10 people in person and 50 online, you could put group internet based for everyone. Or if it was vice versa, 50 in person, 10 online, you could put group live for everyone. So what the label that goes on the certificate can be driven by the attendance percentages, but don't confuse that with the requirements. Anyone that attends alone virtually, right, that qualifies as like group internet based, is still required to complete the participation checks, right? So if you had 1,000 people in person and 1 person online, that 1 person, even though their certificate can say group live because that's the majority of the attendees, that 1 person who's joining individually would still need to have satisfied those participation checks.
Great. And I noticed one note there with respect to blended. Hybrid and blended are quite synonymous. And so I've found that question comes up pretty frequently. So what NASBA means specifically by blended, it's you have on demand in conjunction with a live component. So hybrid, as defined by NASBA, is how folks are attending, but assuming everyone is attending live. So that's kind of the main difference there. So I did want to make that distinction clear because, again, those words are so close together that it's understandable why that's confusing. So when we say hybrid, it means everyone's attending live, Blended by the NASBA standards means there's some component either before or after the training that is on demand or self-study. Though they don't necessarily need to follow the self-study standards, but it's kind of something I do on my own time. And then there's a live component, and I'm able to get some amount of combined credit for those two things.
So I know that we're just about at time here, and I want to respect everyone's time and really appreciate everyone attending. I hope this was useful. I'm happy to hang out for a bit and keep going through some of these questions, but I'm sure people have other meetings and things to get to. So if you need to jump, feel free. We'll also make sure to send out like a full Q&A recap with answers to all these questions, along with the recording, which I know someone asked if the recording will be available, which answer to that is yes. We'll send that out again with a copy of the Q&A recap. So for anyone that doesn't need to jump, thanks again for attending. If you guys need anything, feel free to reach out to us. I'm sure Evan says the same. And Evan, I don't know what your schedule looks like, but I'm happy to hang for 5 more minutes to keep going through some of these questions if anyone does want to hang out.
Absolutely. Yep.
Cool. All right. So here's one that I did want to just mention. I know we answered this earlier, but I was talking specifically about code words, right? Where I said, it really is up to you. Usually, so they have to submit them by the end of the session, but you could extend it if you want to. There was a separate question that came in that also asked about polls. Now, polls are a little bit different, right? Polls, there is that kind of reliance on you got to respond to the poll while it's active, right? Because you wouldn't want to leave all the polls available the whole time, because then someone could just respond to them all at the end, and it looked like they were participating throughout. So the polls are a little different to my answer earlier, but that's again controlled by, if you're using like our PowerPoint integration, it's basically they have to respond while the poll is active. And that can be up to the instructor to determine how long. You can do preset timers. So there's some different options there, but I just wanted to point out that was an important distinction there. Evan, I saw one for you. Oh yeah. This one, I think you spoke briefly about this earlier, but.
Yes. Yeah. So this is similar to that second example that I shared, where I'll provide 2 examples. So one is, let's say you have a day-long training, you're going to allow folks to check in and check out periodically throughout the day. Maybe you expect everyone to attend all of the sessions, maybe only some people for certain sessions. You may, in Conferences.io, even have parallel sessions that people can pick and choose from. In any case, you can basically pick any of the Conferences.io sessions that you want to link with a particular Proalera event, and it will pull in and compile all of the collective participation details. And again, what makes the actual credit validation process really quick and easy is if you go through and do the credit adjuster in Conferences.io, it will sum up each subject area for all of those different sessions and override the Proalera credit with the user or attendee specific credit. So that's really awesome. So that can work whether it's a 1-day session, or if you might have multiple days where people are checking in and checking out, for, let's just say they do a morning and afternoon session for 3 days worth of training. You'd have 6 Conferences.io sessions that you would add. You do the credit adjustments for each session in Conferences.io, and then all that data will get summed up in Proalera for you and make it really easy to issue your credits. So that's a great option. Anytime you have a bigger event, you want to issue one certificate that comprises all of the collective participation of that event.
So there's a couple more. Someone asked, so does the organization in the case study that I referenced use Proalera as a LMS? So that was the Virginia Society of CPAs. No, that they actually they use an AMS as an association. I mean, basically the same thing, but that actually wasn't Proalera. But that the integration with that AMS is actually more limited than the capabilities now of the Proalera integration. So So that 80% reduction in time savings probably would be even larger with the additional capabilities of the Prolaera integration. And then maybe we'll just do like one more. So let's see. So this is one of the early questions that came in. Was that, are you ready to check out message automated to go at the end of the session? So I think what they're referring to here was this message. Yeah, this one here. So that's not automated to pop up. That message displays once the attendee clicks checkout. So it just kind of makes them confirm, yeah, I want to check out of this session. That's when that displays. So it's not, doesn't like automatically do it, but again, you do have the option to use that bulk checkout as well, which would essentially achieve the same thing. All right, so let's stop there. I know there's a couple that we didn't get to, but like I said, we'll send out a full Q&A recap. Thanks everyone for again for attending and for hanging out a little late here with us. Evan, thank you for all your help with this. Really impressed by what your team has pulled off. I think the Proalera users are gonna really love it. So with that, we'll kind of wrap up. We'll get you those follow-up resources that we mentioned, and thanks again.
Yeah, thanks, John. Really appreciate you helping pull this together. And yeah, looking forward to any questions, particularly those of you who already use Prolaera. There's, again, a lot of moving parts to this whole process and different unique scenarios. So just reach out if we can help you figure out the best process for you. And please reach out to John if you'd like to learn more about Conferences.io as well. I think as we go into this hybrid, as we think about it, essentially a permanent hybrid future, I think what you and the team at Conferences.io are doing is going to be pretty instrumental to making this painless, easy and smooth. Yeah, not just now, but particularly as we get further into the future. So thanks everyone for joining. Really appreciate it.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Bye.